Hello and welcome to The Dailyaus. I'm Lucy Tassell.
I'm Sam Koslowski.
For the first time, Israel has struck Qatar. Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu said the strike on the capital city Doha was targeting Hamas leadership. Hamas has said none of its leaders or ceasefire negotiating team were killed, but 6 others were. In today's episode, we'll explain the significance of the strike and Qatar's relationship in the region.
Lucy, I'm sure that our listeners could already tell just how much context there is here to unpack. We've spent a lot of time over the past 2 years at least trying to put together the pieces of context in explaining events happening in the Middle East.
Yeah.
For brevity and for the best chance of understanding the key dynamics here, why don't we start with the strike itself? So what do we know about this strike that Israel launched in Qatar?
Yeah, so this was the first known strike by Israel on Qatar. Israeli fighter planes struck a building in Doha, the capital, on Tuesday afternoon, local time. Hamas said the strike targeted members of its ceasefire negotiations team, but that they survived. The group said Israel had killed 6 people, 5 of whom were associated with the group, including the son of its chief negotiator. And then Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu posted soon after the strike saying Israel took, quote, full responsibility for the strike, I think to make it clear that this wasn't something that he had the US's help with.
Got it. And so in that statement from Netanyahu, did he give justification for why this strike took place?
Yeah, he said it was, quote, fully justified because of the 7 October attack by Hamas on Israel and by a shooting in Jerusalem earlier in the week.
And so to kind of bring all of that together, this strike on the negotiating team for Hamas in the country of Qatar was fully justified in Netanyahu's words because of the original 7th of October attack. But perhaps the catalyst most recently is this shooting in Jerusalem. Talk to me about that shooting.
Yeah, so those were both his kind of stated reasons.
Right.
And that shooting happened in Jerusalem earlier this week. 2 gunmen opened fire at a bus stop, killing 6 people. They were reportedly shot dead by Israeli security forces at the scene, and a 3rd person was later arrested. The shooting was at Ramot Junction, which is a major intersection in an area that the International Court of Justice actually considers illegally occupied by Israel. Hamas initially didn't take responsibility for that shooting, but then overnight they announced, actually, we were responsible. That's what they said.
So this shooting happens in Israel, the second deadliest shooting in Israel since October 7. It elicits a big response from the government. But on Hamas, we know that it's governed Gaza since the 2000s.
Yeah.
This isn't new.
Yeah.
Why then were leaders based in Qatar? And can you go a bit deeper on the relationship between Hamas and Qatar?
Yeah. So Hamas has had an office in Qatar for many years. It houses its political arm and obviously now houses the negotiators Hamas's negotiators with Israel, because Qatar has been hosting and overseeing these negotiations since 2023. Qatari officials say this office was actually set up with the support of the US, which is Israel's closest ally. And the aim of this was to set up indirect lines of communication. This is actually a very common thing that governments do, that governments will communicate with each other or communicate with other groups in sort of a roundabout or indirect way, because even if a group or a country is in opposition to you, you might still have reasons to talk to them.
Well, you might need to in some situations. And so that idea of kind of having a country with established frameworks for you to sit down at this almost middle ground or neutral territory is valuable for governments all over the world. Yeah,
or to relay messages. So there's another example that I can give, which is that Australia has recently closed our embassy in the capital of Iran, in Tehran, but that doesn't mean that Australia is no longer talking to Iran at all. Obviously, there are plenty of Iranian Australians who have ties there, and then the government also, we can talk through other Western nations that still have embassies there because we might still have reasons to talk to them. So this is just a very standard practice that even if it's a regime or a group that you might have prescribed as a terrorist organization, you might still have to talk to them. So there's got to be a way for that to happen. The other thing I should touch on is that Qatar has given a lot of funding to Gaza since that office was set up in 2012. And I mean, a lot of money. I'm talking more than $1 billion US.
Right.
A lot of that has gone to the government in Gaza, which is run by Hamas, as we know, and a lot of international media outlets, and I truly mean international, I mean international news wires, US media and Israeli media, all say Israel's government approved of and facilitated this funding arrangement until October 2023.
And I think what you're painting is this very complex picture where there's no real benefit in us trying to frame this as a simple, side A versus side B with side C in the middle. It is multi-layered and intertwined, a bit like a very complicated diplomatic spider web.
Mm-hmm.
So then explain to me the relationship then. So we understand the relationship between Hamas and Qatar.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what's the relationship between Israel and Qatar?
Hi, I'm Ola.
And I'm Elliot.
We're the two-person team behind everything video and audio here at thedailyaus.
If you want to help us grow so we can deliver more of the content that you love, be sure to hit subscribe.
Now let's get back to the video.
So I've been talking before about indirect relationships, and this is another one of those kind of relationships that's characterized by indirect communication, often in the sense of Qatar's role as mediators between Hamas and Israel. The groundwork for this role, like the reason why Qatar kind of has taken on this role as an international mediator, is that was kind of laid back in the 1990s when Qatar pledged its support for the 1993 Oslo Accords, which were an early attempt at Arab-Israeli peace. At the time, this was significant because in backing calls for there to be a Palestinian state and an Israeli state, Qatar was recognizing legally that the state of Israel exists.
One of the first Arab nations to do that. So it's always been kind of I like to think about Qatar almost as a bit of a calm head in the neighborhood that can be a bit chaotic.
Yeah. So then in 1996, Qatar and Israel normalized, that's a legal term, their relationship, which basically means they set up diplomatic and economic ties. You might see that word coming up again in future as more countries kind of normalize relations with the new government of Syria, for example.
Right.
That is something that I expect to see in coming months. In the ensuing years, there's been a lot of ebbs and flows in terms of how strong that relationship is, the nature of that relationship. Sometimes it's been very public. Sometimes it's been driven by kind of indirect dealings, really depends on the situation. And the end result of this is that Qatar has been hosting negotiations between Israel and Hamas since Hamas's attack on Israel. And I mean, really since the beginning. So, for example, you might remember the deal for a 4-day pause in November 2023. That's when hostages taken by Hamas, primarily women and children, were released in exchange for Palestinians held in jails in Israel, also initially largely women and children. And just as a sort of side note, just for clarification's sake, Israeli human rights group B'Tselem has found Israeli authorities have, over the years, detained thousands of Palestinians indefinitely in Israeli jails without laying charges or without holding a trial. So that's what we're talking about when we say prisoners.
And so Qatar's role in all of that, even in those early days, we're talking a fortnight after that initial attack by Hamas in Israel, was to be the host and the facilitator of these talks.
Yeah, that had direct impacts like hostages and people who'd been held in prisons getting set free.
And so when you consider the fact that there are still believed to be at least 20 hostages still held by Hamas in Gaza.
That are alive,
That are alive, about 43, I think, still in possession of the group. You can understand why Qatar continues to play a role because these negotiations are ongoing.
So that's why kind of 2 years in, Qatar is still a really important part of that negotiation, regardless of what stage it's at.
And so these negotiations have been ongoing in Qatar. There's now been a strike that Israel says it was targeting the team of negotiators from Hamas. We don't know exactly who was killed and where in Doha. But what will happen to the talks then? Because I imagine it's going to be hard to kind of pick up and keep going, at least in the same location.
Yeah. I mean, the talks had essentially stalled. The latest update was over the weekend. US President Donald Trump saying Israel had accepted the terms of a ceasefire and hostage release deal, telling Hamas it was its last warning to accept. Hamas said it was discussing ideas about the deal. In terms of kind of the intractable nature of these negotiations, Hamas is seeking a full withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza. Israel is seeking Hamas giving up its weapons and releasing all the remaining hostages. It's hard to see a world location-wise where Qatar continues hosting these talks. Obviously, there was this Israeli strike that was targeting Hamas, but it still had the impact of literally landing on Qatari territory. And you and I were discussing this morning who would volunteer to be a part of this. Egypt and the US have been involved in negotiations. Of those two, the US is part of NATO, the international military bloc, which binds its members to go to war on each other's behalf if they're attacked. I mean, this is hypothetically. It seems very unlikely that Israel would strike its closest ally, even if it were targeting Hamas. But I think that would probably rule out the US just because of that kind of binding obligation.
Sure.
But then again, as I said, who would volunteer for the possibility of, after 2 years of negotiations, that you could be fired upon? There's also the possibility that ceasefire negotiations would continue in a location without Hamas present, but that would effectively make them illegitimate.
Which is kind of the conversations that we've been having in the context of Russia and Ukraine. This idea of Donald Trump discussing a ceasefire with Putin without Zelensky there representing Ukraine kind of delegitimizes the hopes of a genuine ceasefire. That sort of lens is now being applied here.
Yeah, and then separately talking to Zelensky without Putin.
Got it.
And then stepping away and being like, okay, you guys choose a location, and then that's been impossible.
And so the necessity of a third party, I think, is pretty widely agreed upon from all sides.
Yeah.
What I've taken away from this story that I'm trying to work through is trying to understand the nature of a group in Gaza being controlled from outside the territory and how that's all been set up.
Yeah.
Because I think that hasn't been a topic that we have discussed a lot in the 2 years since, and it's been really brought into the spotlight with this latest strike.
Definitely.
Okay, well, that is a really complex one, Lucy, and I feel like we've been saying this for a couple of years now, but we are going to need to kind of understand what happens next, come back in here and talk our audience through it. We'll be back in the afternoon with your headlines. Until then, have a good day.